The topic of this hour is Buddha, a prophet in Islam. Now, that sounds a little strange probably to some listeners, but it's actually something that comes up in conversation among Muslims. I know my in-laws over in Morocco have discussed this. It's an interesting dinner table discussion. Was Buddha a prophet? And Nadeem, you have written a really interesting article about this. And, I'm kind of skeptical about these esoteric interpretations of Qur'an that say, oh, this means that and that means the other. And how do we really know that? So quite often, people come up with these interpretations of Qur'an and claiming that it means something kind of, specific about this or that. And I say, well, yeah, maybe it does. Ibn Arabi said everything in the Qur'an means everything. There's a million meanings to every word. And if all the trees on earth were pens and all the seas were ink, and then there were more, double the seas on top of that, that would still not use up the words of God. That is the meanings, the fountain of meanings of Qur'an just is endless. However, Nadeem, your article on Buddha and Qur'an that talks about this particular surah, Surah 13, as telling us that Buddha is one of these four big prophets of the post-axial age, it's actually kind of persuasive. I have to admit that you might be onto something. Let's talk about that. So how can Buddha be a prophet of Islam?
Well, first of all, the way I got into this was when I was writing my other book with Muhammad Muslim on the existence of God and consciousness, and then what do the various religions say about God, and I started looking into Buddhism more, and I found passages within their own scriptures where Buddha talks about God. He says that he does believe in God. So I quoted that here in this paper, and then I came across information from the Buddhists themselves, the Tibetan Buddhists, and I quoted them. Especially Thurman, who is an associate of the Dalai Lama, where he himself says that really Buddha was talking about a creator, but he didn't really. He talked about the creator in a more abstract way because the Hindus were really getting into a lot of ritualism, and they believed in statues and idols, and so he was kind of talking about it in a way that was a bit different than that, and people didn't really. Then mistook him to mean that there is no God. But what he was saying was that God is not like anything that you worship. So, and indeed, God is not like anything that we know, right? So, so this is actually from their own scriptures. And then when I sent that to their biggest website, and they blocked us, basically. They didn't want to have a discussion with us. They verbally attacked us and said we were ignorant. But, it was just ad hominem attacks. And then... So what happened is that I was speaking with Edip Yüksel. I don't know if you know him. He's the number 19 guy. He did a lot of research on that.
Right. Yeah. And for the listeners, there's a controversy or a field of study and research around the so-called miracles of the number 19 in Qur'an. And then I've looked a little bit at this, and it looks interesting. I can't vouch for it, and I can't vouch against it at this point, but it does look like it's worth looking into. There are definitely some apparent interesting coincidences around the number 19.
Yeah, so he mentioned some numerical things, and where he was saying that, the number 570, like he thinks that there may be a separation in birth dates between, like there's some kind of pattern, but he wasn't sure. So I looked into it further, and I kind of I'm theorizing that really these prophets were their birth dates were separated by 570 years.
Okay, and let's go through those prophets, because a lot of our listeners probably are lost a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
So let's first mention that Islam holds that there have been thousands of prophets sent to thousands of different cultures and peoples throughout time and space. The Quran itself mostly looks at the Jewish and Christian, with Jesus, of course, and Moses, and all the way back to Adam, peace upon all of them, as well as some Arabian prophets that don't show up in the Torah. But it doesn't necessarily go into every one of those thousands and thousands of prophets who've come to peoples, presumably in the Americas and Asia and Africa, all over the world. So that's the basic background here, is Islam accepts all of these prophets. And then we have kind of the four big prophets of modern times. I mean, who do most people on earth really follow for religious guidance and wisdom in terms of possibly divinely inspired prophets? Well, we would have to say Moses, who's kind of the fountainhead prophet of the Jewish tradition that mutated into Christianity and Islam. And then we have, of course, Buddha, and also of the axial age, and he was now how many years were you saying, Nadeem, later?
You see, they are the historians are not really sure. Some say 550, whatever, or some say 570, and so it's around that time.
Okay, so Moses was around sort of 1,000 something BC, and then Buddha was right there at the height of the axial age, sort of 500-ish BC, and then Jesus, of course, was 0 BC or whatever, and Muhammad, peace upon him, was born in 570. The year of the elephant, according to the most reliable sources that we have. Yeah. And so basically we have about 570 years more or less between each of these great prophets. And these are the ones that if you look around the world today, who are the real sources of this guidance from on high. And these would probably have to be kind of considered the top four for most people. There are Zoroastrians out there, and there are Hindus, and there are followers of the Tao and Lao Tzu and things like that. Maybe some followers of Confucius, and there are some schools of followers of Socrates, I'm sure, and whatever. But in terms of the really major ones that have endured through our time, I think those four are the ones that most people would choose if they had to pick four. And you're saying that it looks like they're about 570 years apart.
Yeah. Okay. And before I get into that, maybe it's more important to actually read the Surah itself. So it says here, this is a surah, a chapter from the Qur'an. It says, by the fig, by the olive, by mount or place of Sinai, by the safe city, we, God, created man in the finest state, then reduced him to the lowest of the low. But those who believe through confirmation and do good deeds will have an unfailing reward. After this, what makes you deny the judgment? Is God not the fairest of judges? So what I'm saying here is basically... It
sounds a lot better in Arabic than وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ وَطُورِ سِنِينَ وَهَذَا الْبَلَدِ الْأَمِينَ لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ فِي أَسْفَلِ السَّافِلِينَ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَلَهُمْ أَجْرٌ غَيْرُ مَمْنُونٍ ما يكذب بعض بالدين فليس الله بأحكام الحاكمين. And that was a terrible recitation, but it still sounded better than the English.
Oh yeah, it was much better. But so basically, what I'm saying is that the fig here represents Buddha when he was sitting under the bo tree, which is a fig tree, and that's when he got his enlightenment. When he says he awoke, the word Buddha means one who is awake. And then after that, he went and preached. The olive is when Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and that's where he started to preach from that point onwards, or he was preaching at the Mount there of Olives. And the Mount of Sinai, of course, that's Moses.
Moses got his books, his tablet. Yeah.
And then of course the secure city, Makkah, right? So that's where the prophet went into the cave, and then so really now, what we're saying is that, we don't know about the fig. It's just a fig. But the rest are actually related to prophet. It doesn't make sense. The fig must also follow a similar pattern, right?
Because, this is the sort of thing that normally I don't find, I hear arguments like this that aren't convincing, but this one is kind of convincing to me. I mean, this surah, this Quranic passage really begins with these four items. The teen is the date, zaytun is the olive, Mount Sinai, Torah Sinin, right? Teen was zaytuni with Torah Sinin. And so you're saying that the fig tree, this is the tree that the Buddha got his revelation under. So this is basically referring to where the revelations came. And then the last one is the Balad al-Amin, the secure city, referring to Mecca. So it actually does, you don't have to stretch this on a Procrustean bed to say these look like the sites of these four revelations.
Yeah, exactly. And so what happens is that once you have these four now, and you see, you have to remember that Buddha, he came for the reformation of Hinduism. I mean, see, the Hindus had their own prophets even before Buddha, but they went astray, and so Buddha was another prophet who came there to, or teacher, if you don't believe he's a prophet, to make them get away from superstition and ritualism and all. So really, he's also covers Hinduism, because actually he was a reformer for Hinduism. But then also his message spread to China, Japan. So really he covers that area. So really these prophets, they actually cover over 90% of mankind. And I think the idea here of this verse is to show that they were all prophets and that there's only one message. And that message is, it talks about that message there that, amana, it talks about confirmation. We were talking about reasoning, right? So if you confirm things and you do good deeds, then you will have an unfailing reward. Because if you confirm things and do good deeds, that's what you need to get to paradise. So that's the goal. So all these, the core message is this. The core message of all these systems is this basic thing that is in Surah 10. That's why I think it's a very important surah. I think the Prophet said it's extremely important. But, people are wondering, why is it important? She's talking about a fig. I mean, that's just a fruit, But,
right. Well, the linguistic structure is interesting because this is God kind of swearing by something. This is one of the interesting features of Qur'an, is that in some of these surahs it begins with God kind of, when you swear by something in a way that's a normal human being would sort of say by whatever, something valuable, to insist that their word is true and good. And when God does it in Qur'an, it's by things that kind of are very evocative of some sort of powerful spiritual or kind of emotional kind of feeling or what have you. And in this case, God is swearing by the fig, the olive, Mount Sinai, and the secure city. And it sounds so beautiful in the original, but it's a little confusing too. It's sort of, you ask yourself, why is God swearing by these things? And it sounds like you're coming up with as good an answer as I've heard.
Yeah, I think that's the reason. And then of course, the other part was, the part that, before I get into the mathematical aspects of it, it has to do with another thing actually. The name Dhul Kifli. There's a prophet mentioned in the Quran by the name of Dhul Kifli. And the word Dhul Kifli means one from, Kifl. But what's Kifli? Now, so a lot of other Muslim researchers have said that Kifl actually is Kapil. Kapil is the place where Buddha migrated to and lived there. So he lived in Kapila Vastu. Kapila Vastu also means from Kapil. So it means the same thing as Dhul Kifl. Now, in Arabic, and you know more than me about this, is, there's a guy who in Canada who became a Muslim. They call him Kanadi, or that's
the nisba. That's the nisba adjective, and it so the last part of the person's name you can tack on this nisba word that is where they're from. I've actually I've gone by the name Abdul Basir al-Buhairi, which means the Buhairi part means the guy from the lake, because I live next to a lake.
Yeah. So it's possible to, so what I'm saying is Dhul Kifli means exactly the same thing as Kapila Vastu. It literally means, because of Vastu, what did I say here? Yeah, Vastu, it means from, I believe. Mm-hmm. Or Avastu means from. Anyway, so it means the same thing. Now, but in Arabic, you don't have the P sound, right? So that's what I'm saying is Kifl rather than Kifl.
Right.
So they used to have trade routes. So maybe they were calling that place, Dhul Kifl. Or maybe it's just a word that God decided to use. It could be either one of the two.
Well, I don't know, because actually, people knew about Buddhism in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean world. This is something that was brought out in a book I recently read called The Silk Roads by a guy named Frank Open, talking about the trade in ideas as well as goods across Eurasia that goes way back for millennia. And I didn't realize that, it wasn't just Alexander the Great that brought back Buddhists. That there was, that they were trading and exchanging ideas. There were Buddhists around the Mediterranean, a few of them. They didn't get too far in their proselytizing in terms of converting huge communities, but Buddhism was a presence in that part of the world.
Yes, and then there's other proof, because in the Quran it says that you have been mentioned in other scriptures, that Prophet Muhammad has been mentioned in other scriptures. So the idea here is that each prophet knew of the coming of the final prophet. And so, for example, the one where Ananda, his disciple, asked the Buddha that, who shall teach us when you are gone? And the Blessed One replied, I am not the first Buddha who came upon the earth, nor shall I be the last. In due time, another Buddha will arise in the world, a holy one, a supremely enlightened one, endowed with wisdom in conduct, auspicious, knowing the universe, an incomparable leader of men, a master of angels and mortals. He will reveal to you the same eternal truths which I have taught you. He will preach his religion, glorious in its origin, glorious at its climax, and glorious at the goal. He will proclaim a religious life, wholly perfect and pure, as such I now proclaim. His disciple will number many thousands, while mine number many hundreds. Ananda said, how shall we know him? The Blessed One said, he will be known as Maitreya. Maitreya means the mercy. Now, the Prophet Muhammad is the only prophet, person who's been called a mercy unto the world, right? So, and he had thousands of followers. Some people say it's Jesus, but Jesus never had thousands of followers in his lifetime. So if this, I'm just saying that, there's so much, evidence pointing to this, right?
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah.
And then Maitreya. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the message of these prophets being the same is an interesting concept. And, if you're looking for similarities, you certainly can find them. If you're looking for differences, you can find those too. At a deep level, it seems to me that there are serious commonalities between these great religions. Isutsu has written great stuff on Islam. Especially he focuses on Sufi mystical Islam and Buddhism. But it seems to me that the Buddhism focuses heavily on a kind of psychology, spiritual psychology, that's also clearly present in Islam, and I suppose Christianity as well. In Buddhism, there are these noble truths about how life is suffering, and the root of suffering is desire, and the way to enlightenment and inner peace is through a kind of letting go of desire. And in Islam, we have the idea that the nafs al-amra bisu, the ego that desires evil, this ego that commands evil, which is what gives us people like Pharaoh, the egotistical, power-hungry creep who's, thinks he's the greatest and wants everybody to worship him as God. We see some certain politicians kind of like that these days. Well, that's the wrong way to be. The right way to be is to let go of the ego, to overcome this ego that desires evil, which is very much what Buddhism is teaching. And then if you look at the career of Jesus, peace upon him, you see kind of the same thing. Jesus is teaching people how to let go of this ego that desires evil, and then they are holy and can conduct healing miracles, and they live for each other, take care of each other. They're no longer egotistical, people fighting for more status and wealth and power, but they're sharing everything. And suddenly the kingdom of God is within them, and then it becomes around them, because when everybody has reached this level of whatever, I call it enlightenment, they're sharing and caring, right? So these messages they have this very, very strong commonality. With Moses, it's not quite as clear, but there's certainly a message of liberation in the story of Moses that does roughly dovetail with this.
Yes, and I think someone actually Edith was asking me what I thought of the order when I first mentioned this to him. Because it's mentioned in a certain order too, right? And the order is not haphazard in the Quran. Whenever there's an order, everything is there's a specific reason why it's there in that place. So it says watin wa zaytun wa tur sinin wa hadha al-baladil amin. So the order is that the grouping seems to be that you have the fig and the olive, they're together, and then you have the Mount Sinai and the Makkah, grouped together. Because I think if what I'm saying is true, and it does represent Buddha and these other prophets, then what's happening is that Buddha is kind of you see. When Jesus came, he came to reform the. He didn't come to abolish the law of the prophets, right? That's what he said too, right? He came to reform them and bring this idea of love, because they become very ritualistic and all that kind of stuff. Same with Buddha. He was trying to reform probably Vedanta philosophy, things that had gone askew from Vedanta philosophy. So he's trying to bring them back, right? But with Prophet Muhammad and Moses, they came with the law, didn't they? They came with the laws. So right. It's possible that the reason for the grouping is because those two, because you could say, why is Moses not listed first? Because in time he would be first, right? It's because, maybe it's talking about that these guys are similar because they brought the law. Prophet Muhammad brought the law and Moses brought the law. So I'm just, speculating here, as to why, this, that may be.
That's really interesting, yeah. Well, in terms of time, the first two, the Buddha and Jesus are in the middle, and then the last two, Moses and Prophet Muhammad, and peace upon all of them, they're the first and the last. Moses being the first and Muhammad being the last. And so the pattern that we would have here is kind of the first one, Moses bringing the law, and then 570 years later, or what have you, that we have Buddha reforming Hinduism, in moving away from ritualism and towards love and towards letting just pure letting go of ego, and then Jesus doing the same thing with the Jewish tradition, and then Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, kind of restating the law, but it's a simpler, more straightforward law, and kind of clarifying the message of all the prophets. I think is really the role of Muhammad. Yes,
exactly. And then I had something else in there about Maitreya. Now I could be wrong here, and someone has talked about this, but I did research on it. The word Treya, it does mean three in Pali and Sanskrit, and Maitreya could mean the three M's. Like linguistically, I think it's fine because Muhammad, it also has this kind of the M sound, right? Like so that's another interesting point. And what else was there?
Well, there's and Alif Lam Mim is supposedly sort of the beginning and the end, with Mim being the end. In these, there are these mystical letters that are given in Qur'an, and the one common pattern is Alif Lam Mim, and Alif is the first letter in the alphabet, and typically Mim is seen as sort of the end, and so that's interpreted sometimes as kind of the beginning and the ending. So the Mim is also associated with kind of final matters.
Could be. That's interesting. I didn't think of it that way. That's interesting. So then the other thing was, it's just that this whole thing about the numerical stuff. It has to do with believe it or not, calculating the day of judgment, when that will occur. Because when Rashad Khalifa, who went a bit crazy at the end, where he started to say a lot of things. Probably
right, and just for the listeners who don't know anything about this, Rashad Khalifa was a Muslim from, I think, Arizona, who did a lot of work on this mysterious number 19 in the Qur'an, the miracle of the 19. And then he got so excited about it that he started kind of almost like claiming to be some sort of prophet, or claiming something, some high level or whatever, and got himself in stirring up a lot of controversy. Was he murdered or something? It's been a long time since I studied him.
He was actually murdered by some people say by people who were part of so-called Al Qaeda. Believe it or not.
Really? Wow. I wonder if that was a false flag too. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So what's happening here is that maybe you could interview Edith Yüksel about number 19. So I won't get into number 19 in depth, but basically, in my opinion, is that there is that number 19 system in the Quran, because the probability for these letter counts can't occur by chance. Now, what's happened is that because Rashad Khalifa said he is a messenger and all that of the covenant, people reacted against that and then dropped a lot of his work and his findings, right? So I think that was wrong. That was a mistake. So what's happened is that 30 years have passed by and people have forgotten about this. But now people are starting to look at into it again. And they're finding out, indeed, the number 19 system does work. And Edith Yüksel has done more work on it. And there's still some unanswered questions, but it's an ongoing process. But the probability for the number 19 system to be there, the letter counts to be by chance, it's just impossible. So
can you sketch out sort of briefly one aspect of this number miracle? Like, is there a way to describe in words rather than mathematical language here on the radio one of the ways that the number 19 occurs miraculously in Quran?
Yeah. So you have, for example, Surah 19. Okay, so some of these surahs, they start with these letters like. Let me give you an example.
Right. The Surah of the Cave.
Yeah. Yeah. 1 second. No, Mary. I think that's 19. Surah 19.
No, that's right.
But let me.
Cap is 18.
Yeah. So let me give an example for viewers in English. Let's say that you were writing a book, a chapter which was let's say 30 pages, and you started out by saying P, Q, and Z, and then you started, saying what you wanted to say, and people recorded it. So the way it works is that, P, Q, and Z would be, if you counted the number of times they occurred in your statements, they would be a number of a frequency of 19. They would be divisible by 19, right? Like, say for example, if P occurred 57 times, then that's a multiple of 19, right? So if you have when you have, let's say for example, Mary, okay, the chapter Mary. So it's actually with Kaf, He, Ye, Ain, and Sod. Okay, there are these 4 letters. It starts with them. It just mentions those letters, and those letters, the letter count is 798, which is 19 times 42. So whenever you have these letter counts, when you add the number of times they occur, it's a multiple of 19. But there's so many other things connected with 19.
Sorry, is that
maybe
true
you can have
throughout the whole Quran? That every single time that these letter counts occur, that they always add up to multiples of 19?
Well, you see, it's more complex than that, and that's where the problem occurred. Because, for example, Abu Bilal Phillips, who I also know because he used to be in Toronto, who was a kind of very antagonistic towards Edith, actually. He said that this is all garbage because it's not consistent. Because for some surahs where, let's say if you have I can't remember the details, but you have 2 surahs with if you have 1 surah with Kaf, for example. I'm just giving an example. That's not accurate, but and you count the number of times it occurs. It may not be a number of 19, but if you have another one and you count both of them, then it occurs by then when you take both of them, then it's the total adds up. So then you say, oh, how come you have to take 2 or 3 to add up? It's not consistent. But actually, there may I believe there's an even bigger mathematical pattern involved here. And some a mathematician has done. He's from Switzerland. He's done work on this. So it's even more complex than we know. The word Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, that's 19 letters. I mean, and in the Quran it says that in this book, the Quran itself mentions that it's based on 19. Some people think it's mentioning angels, but really it doesn't say angels. It says on it are 19, right? So. What happened is
you think the Freemasonic enemies of God who engineered the 9/11 deception chose 19 hijackers for their myth based on this? Do you think they were, because there's talk about how these kind of demonic, satanic Freemasonic people that engineered 9/11, these people do these kind of dark magic rituals that, for instance, there was an orb in the courtyard of the Trade Center right between the buildings that were demolished that is supposedly some kind of globalist takeoff on the Kaaba. So it just occurs to me that with 19 playing this important role in Quran, that these people might have chosen that number for their supposed hijackers as another of their nudges and winks. Just like the Twin Towers being the Freemasonic towers, and the Pentagon being the pentagram, the biggest symbol of Freemasonry. These people are constantly leaving numerical clues to what they do as well.
Yeah, because it's very weird because you even have the Young Turks, Kamal Ataturk, all these guys who were Freemasons. Basically, they had to prostrate to the Quran or kiss it or whatever. And it's very strange, right? So you never know, because this number 19, I think even in Canada, they arrested 19 people, then they let them go, So it's kind of weird that this number 19 keeps appearing. I don't know, there may be something to it, perhaps. But just to explain, the calculation that I've done here, it's very complicated, and I think people should maybe read the article. It's difficult to explain it, but in a nutshell, what happened is that Rashad Khalifa said that the end of the world has been coded in the Quran based on the number 19, because when there's a hadith of the Prophet, and some people dispute and say like that it's not really authentic and all that, but I think it may be authentic because they said that, when you have all these letters before certain verses like alif, lam, mim, and kaf and all that, when you add their values, because in Arabic, before the Arabic numerals were introduced, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the way we write them to Arabia, each Arabic letter had a value. It's called abjad, right? So alif, that's like A, had a value, and B had a value, Te, each letter had a value, right? Mm-hmm. So they said that these letters, when you add them up, they tell you when the end of the world is going to occur. And so they started to kind of, add them, and they came up with a certain number, and the Prophet never refuted them. So what Rashad Khalifa did is he kind of used the abjad system to calculate the total, and it comes out to 1709. And through some calculations, it's a long story, but through some calculations, you come up with 2280. And it's linked to some Quranic verses, even the verse of the cave and, other verses. And what I found interesting is that this Surah of Teen, which is Surah 95, for example, if you took 95 and you multiplied it by 6, you get 570, right? Remember I was telling you it's 570? Okay. And if you then calculate the date of birth of Moses, right, then it's before the date of birth of Buddha, right? Mm-hmm. So that takes you back into the BC, right? So it takes you way back. It takes you back into BC, and then let me show you something here. I hope I'm not losing anybody here.
Yeah. Well, that pattern of these prophets that you mentioned as being possibly cited in Surah Tatin, the Surah of the Fig, being about 570 years apart. I think that is roughly accurate. But with Moses, nobody knows for sure.
Okay, so what's happening with Moses is the following, because there's some people revising it and they're saying it's around 11 something, right? They're bringing it closer. So if you take Buddha as 570 BC and you add another 570, right, you get minus 1140, right?
That's very close. Yes.
Okay, so yeah. So now you have 1140, right? Now remember I said that Surah Teen is chapter 95, and if you multiply that by 6, you get 570, right? Okay. Now interestingly, if you take 570 and you multiply it by 6, you get 3,420. And when you add that to minus 1140 BC, you again get 2280, which has been calculated through another means, by Rashad Khalifa.
Wow.
Now, for example, if you take 1709, which is he's saying that the end of the earth is going to occur in 1709.
Islamic calendar, of course.
No. This is the lunar calendar. But if you convert, that's the amazing thing. If you convert the lunar calendar, 1709 to if you convert the lunar to the solar, it becomes 1658 point something. If you add it to the Hijrah, which is 622, you get 2280 again. So
the world is scheduled to end in 2280.
Yeah, so don't buy any property if you're.
Wow. That's a terrible basis for a doomsday cult, Nadeem, because if we start a doomsday cult, the world has to be ending tomorrow or next week or it has to end pretty soon. If we say join our cult, the world's going to end in 2280, nobody's going to join.
I know it's.
Give us all your property.
Right? So all I'm saying is, this is very, very detailed calculations here, and I think this whole thing has been given a bad name because you have the Jehovah's Witnesses that said, "Oh, the Earth is going to end in 1914." You see people standing up with signs. So if you say this guy's a nut. He's saying it's going to end and all that. It must be crap. But really, the Quran. You see, the Quran says in the Quran itself that we have almost hidden, when the Day of Judgment is going to occur. The reason it's almost hidden is if you know the code, then you can break it. But if you don't, then it's hidden. That's why it's
interesting because
hidden.
Usually, I think I've probably misquoted Quran by, saying that it says only Allah knows when the hour will come, but it's not. That's not necessarily the only way to translate it. It sounds like you're saying that it's there's an almost hidden in there, and so these
Akadu, the word akadu, the hour is surely coming. I keep it almost hidden. akadu.
Interesting.
Each consciousness. And then, so really, and then there's another verse which said that God will reveal when the time is going to come. Now, is he going to send another revelation? No, he's not. It's up to us to figure it out. That's why he's saying, I'll disclose it. So what I think is that this calculation actually discloses the time. Now, you can actually calculate the exact date and time, because you see, when you do the calculation, you come up with 1658 point something, right? And you can take the point and you can work out the exact month and time too. I think so. That's, you can actually do it very accurately.
But the way things are going, Nadeem, do you really think that humanity could last until 2280?
I don't know.
The march of folly is so seemingly rapid. I don't know. I think that sounds kind of optimistic.
Well, the thing is that the end of the Earth is going to be a universal cataclysm. It's not going to be the end of mankind. It's not going to be nuclear or anything like that. I'm not saying that there won't be great destruction, but as far as the Quran goes, it's a natural phenomenon, basically. And
so the descriptions. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about those descriptions of the end of the world in Quran, because they're so evocative. There's the Surah of the earthquake, al-Zilzala, and the Qariya. Who can tell you what the Qariya is? These descriptions of mountains being blasted so that what used to be a mountain is like carded wool fluff, and seas boiling over. If the Bukhari is Sujirat, I think it is, the seas boiling over, the mountains being blasted into smithereens.
Brought together. So there's it's going to be a universal cataclysm. So, and the date is fixed. That's what the Quran says. You can't move it back.
But wait a minute. Okay, is it necessarily universal? So the mountains here on Earth are being blasted to smithereens. The seas are boiling over. That could happen if, for instance, some kind of heavenly body got too close to the Earth and its gravity kind of, really messed with the Earth. I was reading a book called The End of the World News by Anthony Burgess, the author of Clockwork Orange and various other things, which is sort of envisioning the end of the world coming by way of a heavenly body, a worlds in collision scenario. And it reminded me a lot of some of these descriptions in Quran, which, those descriptions in Quran don't sound to me like they're necessarily talking about the entire universe or all of the worlds, all of the universes necessarily imploding at once. It could be something that happens to Earth.
This is a very interesting question, that needs to be, that further research needs to be done. Right now, I'm of the opinion, by analyzing all these Quranic verses, that it's going to be the whole universe. But it might be local. It's possible. We have to look into it. Because, as you know, concerning, the other topic about Sirius, it was a kind of a local, catastrophe, apparently, from what we know, the Quran, right? But nonetheless, the Earth is going to be destroyed in a natural way. And it's going to happen suddenly. The Quran says it's sudden. It's suddenly. And it says also that you were given signs before this. That's going to happen, which is interesting, right? Could what I'm talking about be the signs? For example, this 570. The interesting thing is that it says in the Quran that Jesus is a sign of the hour, and this puzzled me a lot, right? And it's not talking about it says he surely is the knowledge of the hour. It says that his person is the knowledge of the hour. What I'm saying is that this 570 system is actually pointing to that, because if you take him out, you can't get that calculation, right? You can't get that calculation, because all these 570s, they basically add up to 2280 as well.
Well, if Jesus is a sign of the hour, though, couldn't that be because, as so many Islamic eschatologists would tell us, that Jesus is coming back in the end times?
I think that's a kind of an interpretation, but I think it's a far-fetched interpretation of this verse. Look, the verse is saying he surely is the knowledge of the hour. Remember, it's not saying that he is coming himself. Now, what does it mean by knowledge of the hour? He is knowledge of the hour. It has to do with his, I think, with his characteristic, or something about him. And one thing about a person is what, when the person is born, right? Like when you're at the immigration, passport control. They look at your passport and they'll say, okay, Kevin Barrett born on a certain date and so on and so
Well, that's in
so
this
forth. So I
culture,
think
but
that
in many cultures, people were not that obsessed with birth dates. In fact, most historians would say that we don't really know for sure which year any of these prophets were born.
that maybe you're right there, but I think that all these kind of sophisticated calculation things, because remember in the Quran it says that we will show them our signs in the farthest horizon, in the horizon within themselves until they know the truth. So all these things which are coming out about the Big Bang, the expanding universe, maybe what I'm talking about too, number 19 calculations, they're for now, right? So it's like you can only understand these verses now, because the verse on the Big Bang, people couldn't understand it before, right? It said the universe and the earth are one piece, and we ripped them apart. People couldn't understand that until now. So there are other verses like this, which I think that maybe we can understand them now. That because nowhere in the Quran does it say that Jesus will come down. It is not mentioned. That has not been mentioned in the Quran. In fact, you get the opposite, where Jesus says, "Oh, I never told them to worship me when I was gone. You were the witness." That's what he says to God, right? So, but that comes from the Hadith. The question is, are those Hadith accurate or not accurate? That's another matter. I have my personal opinion, and
how does one approach the world of Hadith? That the usual way of seeing things in Islam is the Quran is absolutely well preserved, and so we accept that as the direct word of God. And then the Hadith, which are the sayings ascribed to Prophet Muhammad, are sorted through by scholars who then sort of grade them on how sound they are, and they can range from being sound Hadith to true Hadith, sound Hadith, to being dubious or basically incorrect Hadith. And so there's a whole field of study of this, and positions range from. I was recently speaking to a brother who was saying that he's a scholar, and he says that he and his fellow scholars in their approach are mostly working with Hadith and not so much with Quran. And so that's one side, or one sort of position. And then on the other position, there are people who are sort of Quran alone people who say that these Hadith traditions are all kind of inherently, we don't know for sure that that they're well preserved, or how well preserved any of them are really. We have these efforts of scholars in the past to try to grade them, but ultimately we can't really know for sure, so we should really focus on what we know, which is Quran. So there's that wide range of opinion within Islam. And so what's your take on that?
Okay, so my opinion is that if you see, the Hadith were recorded much after, maybe 200 years after, and the question that can be raised is, why did the companions not, record the sayings then? Why did people start doing that only 200 years after? And the reason for that is very simple. It's because the Sahaba, they wanted people to focus on the Quran rather than the Hadith. And I think that that's undeniable, but people don't want to admit it. Now, when they did start to record things 200 years later, then it's like history. You're trying to figure out what happened, right? So I think some things may be true, some may not be true. And my position is that now that we have this body, let's accept those that don't contradict the Quran. But if they contradict the Quran, reject them. That's my position. Mm-hmm. And I know that there are these two extreme positions, but that's the position I would take. It's a kind of an intermediate position. It's a practical position. Because
that makes sense.
Because there was a lot of these sayings that of Prophet are very inspirational too, right? For example, when I wrote my book on animals, which still hasn't been published, I have so many hadith about animals, so many hadith about the earth, the environment. So they kind of embellish, the whole thing. I have verses on the Quran as well, but they do kind of it's like icing on the cake, right? Mm-hmm. And then sometimes where the Prophet said, the blessing of food is the washing of hands before and after. It just makes you think and wash your hands. You know what I'm saying? There's no harm in that. So, but it shouldn't contradict the Quran. That's my main concern, because you also have very absurd hadith that are just totally irrational and illogical, and the Prophet couldn't have said things like that. It's not possible, right? Because we know his character, right? So we have to reject those. And but the problem is that Muslims have canonized the hadith, so they think a lot of them think it's the same level as the Quran, or even more than the Quran, which is kind of very problematic, right? And they
that's what I'm saying. The scholar I met, I was kind of surprised to hear that he and his people spend most of their time on the hadith.
Yeah, and people don't look at the essence of the message, and that's the other problem. Remember in the Quran it says that righteousness is not that you turn your face to the east or the west, but it has to do with taqwa. So similarly, the main thing is that we have to take the essence of the message, and the times change, but the principles have to remain the same. The essence has to remain the same. For example, do you have to give when you slaughter animal, send meat in Hajj? You could send money, for example. The idea is to feed the poor, isn't it? It's the idea remains the same, but the Muslims are very fixated on the forms, and actually that's what Buddha actually came to teach the Hindus. Do you see a similar thing has happened with the Muslims?
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe Muslims almost could use that kind of reminder to to stay with the core message and not get too distracted by literalistic fanatical observance of the forms. I think we see that the kind of irrational insistence on forms with a complete ignorance of the spirit among, let's just say, certain Saudi princes, for example, or the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, which tries to be very, very extreme in its insistence on literalistic interpretations of things, including some hadith that you might wonder if that contradicts Quran. And then they're in this society where it's ruled by people who are behaving in the most un-Islamic manner you could ever imagine. They're piling up wealth, which the Quran says not to do. They're egotistical beyond belief, in the manner of Pharaoh, the villain of Quran, because he's such an egotist. And it seems that there is this kind of irrational element among today's Muslim community, and a lot of it is geared towards this fanatical literalism that ignores the spirit of and even just the common sense interpretation of many of these things.
Yes, and I would go even further and say that, you see, and this may be shocking for Muslims, but they have to come to realize this. You see, the primary revelation is not the Quran. The primary revelation is nature. The primary revelation is the reality in front of you. And the Buddha and the Prophet, they all talked about in this. And the Quran talks about the signs. The Quran talks more about the signs ayat than it does about the Quran itself. So that's the primary revelation. The Quran kind of confirms that. And the Quran tells you what happens after you die and all that. So in that respect, it adds things, right? So that you could not arrive at by reason because you don't have the data, right? So really, the Quran, you should reject the Quran if it contradicts reality, because the Quran itself says, if this book were from other than Allah, then surely you would find in it many inconsistencies, right? So the Quran is challenging you to find inconsistencies, and if it does, you can reject the Quran. Wait a minute. So if you're reading Quran and you find something that looks inconsistent or it looks irrational or wrong, you're saying you should throw the whole book out? I would say it would make more sense to just bracket that particular passage and wait and see if there's an explanation for it. Yeah, that's because, you see, the thing is that in the Quran it says that Allah has revealed, the verses, some which are muhkam, which is well established, and others which are mutashabihah, which means that they look like. And the reason why it uses the word mutashabihah is because it looks like something you can't you can't solve completely. So it looks like something but at the same time you don't know it completely. So for example, let's say 1,000 years ago, the verse which says, do those who cover the truth not see that the universe and the earth are one piece? Someone will understand the language and say, yeah, I understand it, it's one piece, but what does it really mean? I can't understand it cognitively, right? So these verses that were mutashabihah have now become muhkam. Muhkam means those which are well established. So those, who have knowledge, as the Quran says, they will realize that, our knowledge is limited, and the Quran, the whole of the Quran is from God, and we're just trying to, figure out things. But let's say, for example, it said the Quran says that the earth is flat, and we know that it's not flat, then, that's a problem, right? So that doesn't mean you may say, well, there's a problem with that verse, so we don't know how that came in, right? But if it keeps saying things like that, then you know that there's a huge problem, right?
Well, and it's interesting. It's interesting that it doesn't. It's interesting how the Quran, when you approach it as a kind of a naive Westerner, brought up on a secular education, if you're honest, you have to admit that there's really it's kind of there's really not that much that would jump out at you as anything irrational or contradicting what we know of the world.
No, actually, there's nothing. And in fact, people point to verses about slaves, or do Muslims slave? Islam was trying to abolish slavery, but it takes time. There's a phasing out of these practices that humans have done for centuries. It's like someone on drugs. You can't tell.
Yeah, it urges people to free slaves.
Yes.
And
yes.
at that time, that was the anti-slavery message. I mean, that's the only anti-slavery message that there could have been at that time.
Yeah. So it's also and then they pick on things like cutting hands and things. So, but there's nothing really that anybody can really criticize. Of course, as you know much better than me how they take these verses out of context concerning war, and fighting. Right? They really take them out of context.
Right, and if you use common sense in your interpretation of those, and in fact everything else in Quran, you really see that there's an amazing wisdom and common sense there. That is, all of these verses about war are in the context of a particular war after the believers had been persecuted for more than a decade, and finally there was a murder plot against the Prophet. Managed to sneak out of town just in time to save his life, and then God finally gave them permission to fight back instead of having to suffer this persecution on and on and on. So now they can fight back, and they're in this existential war. And so God is then, urging them to fight. And so if you take this out of context, you could say, oh, God is telling us to fight, so let's go out and start killing people. No, that's not what it means. It means in this particular context where there's a defensive war, where the people of God are fighting these persecutors who are bent on exterminating them, then yes, God is urging those people to fight. And God is saying that, yes, you have the right to fight people when they chase you out of your homes. And for instance, you could apply that with common sense to what's going on in Palestine right now, a genocidal situation where people have been expelled from their homes and murdered. And there are others, of course, as well. In those situations, the victims have the right to fight back. So really, Quran is just telling us that we have the right to self-defense. It's a natural human right.
Yes, and in fact, right, I haven't really gotten into this, but inshallah I will, because there's this thing called the just war theory, and I know someone at the Royal Military College. He was a childhood friend of mine. I'm not going to mention his name, but now he's very high up. I contacted him about after 30 years, and he's written about what the Quran says about wars. He's comparing it with the just war theory, and everything about the just war, he finds all those verses in the Quran. It's actually because really, I haven't done research. It's because this whole idea of just war has come from the Quran.
Well, I think it's the fitra. The Quran says that we have this original human nature of fitra. Unlike certain kinds of Christianity, which say that the creation is fallen and flawed and sinful, and people are basically full of original sin. The Quran says that we all, we're the perfect creation of a perfect God. We just forget and need to be reminded. And so the fitra, the original good human nature, is such that we defend ourselves, but we're not that eager to run out and commit aggression and steal other people's stuff. And that's why just war theory, which mostly comes out of this fitra, or a common sense human knowledge, is very much similar to divine revelation in Quran. And this is why the psychopaths, the people of the shaitan, the Satan, a'udhu billah, have to convince people that they're under attack in order to get them to go out and fight aggressive wars. That's why they have to pull off false flags, 9/11, and orchestrate Pearl Harbor and the Gulf of Tonkin and the USS Maine, the USS Liberty, the fake Mexican invasion that started the Mexican War, on and on and on. We see this long list of false flags. It's all because basic human nature, fitra, is defensive. God, or if you're not a theist, our human nature has told us we can defend ourselves. And these psychopaths who they're under the influence of the evil one or whatever, they just don't have that God-given conscience, trick us into starting aggressive wars by convincing us that we are being attacked.
Yeah. Now, didn't you write a book on the history of false flags, or maybe you should if you haven't, because there's so much going back in history. Even during the British rule in India, they had the black hole of Calcutta and stuff which is all false, right? Because they wanted to, control and kill the Indians and control them, right? I mean, it really goes back, way back. And if a book was written on the whole history of this kind of, these kind of things, it would be really interesting, right?
That would be quite a book. Barry Zwicker has treated that a little bit in his book on Towers of Deception, the media cover-up of 9/11. He got into some false flag history there, and he was going to write a whole book on it, and I think it became too big of a subject because, you discover that these things are so common that you're going to have to write, an encyclopedic length volume to cover them, from when Nero burned Rome and blamed the Christians to yesterday's atrocity in Barcelona or whatever. There's so many of these things.
It's amazing. It's really amazing. It seems to be the norm, actually.
Yeah, and that is, I think, ultimately because unscrupulous psychopathic rulers have to fool people, because our basic human nature is, it's certainly not perfect, but it's basically good, and we basically only want to fight in defense, self-defense. We don't want to go out and aggress against other people.
Yes, yeah. And so really tying it with what we're saying about Buddha is that all of mankind is one, and we can all arrive at peace if we follow the message, which is, being conscious of God, using our reason. And then we're the best among creation, right? So that's what the routine is all about, basically. And,
I mean, brother. Well, that's probably a good place to leave it. I hear the music. So thank you, Nadeem Haque, and may Allah reward you for your amazing work in so many fascinating areas. And so keep it up, and I look forward to staying in contact and further conversation down the road, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Take care. Bye. That's Nadeem Haque. And I'm Kevin Barrett. You're listening to Truth Jihad Radio. We will link the pertinent links at the Truth Jihad Radio blog. Go to truthjihad.com, click on the radio link, and you'll get there. So until next time,